Hello everyone, and welcome to Unit 4 of AP Comparative Government and Politics Review. Today we're going to be discussing party and electoral systems and citizen organizations. Really, a huge part of the meat of this course is the Unit 1 and 2, even a bit of Unit 3. And so Unit 4 and Unit 5 really just work together with Unit 1, 2 and 3. And so this unit's a little bit shorter than the others. And I'll have to move my face around a little bit to get us in with our titles. So what are we kind of discussing today? We're looking at electoral systems and rules. And a lot of this, depending kind of how your teacher taught the subject, you may have kind of done this with your political institutions. I teach, as I've mentioned before, I do an overview of all the vocabulary terms. So like a lot of the terms that I'm mentioning in this unit, we did to begin with, and then we looked at the specific examples then when we studied country by country. We're also going to look at political parties, one party versus multi-party versus two-party or two-party dominant systems, and how social movements and interest groups impact a country, and then what it means to be pluralist or corporatist. So what are the big ideas that you're thinking about? This is one of those things that College Board thinks is important, talking about the big ideas. And so these are questions that you should be able to think about, and theoretically you should be able to answer after you have learned this information. And so hopefully these are things that you can already kind of think about now, because this should be review for your AP test. How do different electoral systems encourage or discourage citizen influence? Why are election rules different for different regimes? And why would an authoritarian regime open up political access to interest groups and citizen organizations? And why would a democratic regime restrict political access to interest groups and citizen organizations? These are questions that have actually showed up previous years before they changed the test. These are things that we would have seen before. And so these are overarching ideas that are important as we're looking at this. Remember that when we talk about regime, we're talking about like what type of kind of governmental system runs your country. So are we looking at an illiberal democracy or a liberal democracy? Are we looking at an authoritarian regime? Are we looking at, in the case of Russia, a soft authoritarian regime? So when we look at excuse me, rules and electoral systems, really most everything follows down to proportional or single member district. And there are actually countries, part of that CG6, who actually do what we call a hybrid or a mix of both. So proportional representation results in more political parties, increases the number of women and minority candidates who get elected. Proportional representation, I'm going to show you an image on the graphic to represent on the next slide, because it is one of those things that sometimes you have to kind of visualize to understand the difference. Single member district, often abbreviated SMD, promotes a two-party dominant system. And the reason that you're going to see a two-party dominant system is because it uses the winner-take-all. And with the winner-take-all system, it's going to be really end up always promoting a two-party system. Proportional representation promotes a multi-party system. Single member districts also ensure geographic representation because you are being elected from your area, a single member district, and then a person is elected from that. Now, kind of a question to think about, in the UK, the Liberal Democrats, they actually favor a switch to proportional representation. Now, the UK is what I would consider a two-party dominant system, meaning that they don't just have two parties, they have active political parties. The two major parties, though, are the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, who pretty much always control things. Now, we did have a coalition government under David Cameron where we did not have a majority. The Conservatives had a plurality. They had the most numbers, but they didn't have that over 50%, the majority. So they formed a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. But since that's really the only kind of exception, it's always one of the two parties. There is an active Scottish National Party. There's active Irish political parties, active Welsh party, there's some other parties, but two parties typically dominate everything. Versus, now remember, the United States is not a CG6 country, but for most of you, or many of you, you've also taken US government, so the US also provides for a nice kind of example because we tend to be very familiar with that. The US is a two-party system. While we do have third parties, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, they don't hold seats in Congress. okay, they don't get elected as president. And so they are not active in the sense that they're actually getting people elected at the national level. So we say that the United States is a two-party system versus the UK is a two-party dominant system. So liberal Democrats would favor a switch to proportional representation because they would get way more seats. So if you actually just like Google this, you can find this. I didn't put an image in here, but there's a very popular image where you'll see like the number of in elected and the number of seats, like the percentage of people who voted for liberal Democrats, and then the percentage of the number of seats they got. And then there's usually, like, you could see what would happen if it was proportional representation, and is a significant increase in the number of seats that the liberal Democrats would get. So as we're looking here, kind of these two images just to represent for you what a ballot would look like, kind of how it works, how things work. So when you look at a single member district, you've got, this is the winner-take-all system, right? So in this map A, we see that there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There were 10 ballots kind of cast, if you think, and 6 of those went to the red group, so they win. And the same thing happened in each of them, and they won. Now, this is almost, if you're looking at kind of, this is like very gerrymandered here. This one, you can see here, there's a little, if you draw them differently, but the whole idea is that whoever wins the district, okay, wins. Okay, it doesn't matter that if we take this map and we switched it to proportional, then what we should see is that there would be 4 red representatives and 2 blue representatives. It's a more representative area. But what you do is you go and you vote not for, if you look at this ballot here, you go and you vote for the actual person who's running for the party. This is a single member district, okay? Now, in a proportional, what you see is what would happen is that this would be, you're voting more for the party, okay? And the party then determines kind of how the seat. So if we look at this map, and I take this and I made this proportional, then it really would be 4 reds, 2 blues, okay? And so proportional, it divides out based on the percentage of the vote, okay? And that makes sure that your third parties get elected. There is a great, if you're having any issues with proportional versus a single member district or winner take all, or as the Brits call it, first past the post. We say winner take all a lot of times in the United States, but in Europe it's first past the post. And on the AP test, they typically use first past the post. So if you're having any issue with this all, I would say go to YouTube, look at the CPG Gray video on proportional representation. It is fantastic. I show it to my students. All right, so let's talk about election details, what actually happens. So let's look at presidents. We're talking about presidential systems or semi-presidential systems. So in Mexico, the presidential system, their president is elected with a plurality. Now, this last election with AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, apologize now for any of my pronunciations, especially anything I pronounce for China and Mexico. So plurality, so the previous election when President Nieto was elected, Nieto won, I believe it was like 36% or something, and the second runner-up came up with like 31%. So it's just whoever gets the most. It's a plurality. And when you think about how legitimate then is that presidency when really only 1/3 of the country elected them? I always tell my students that when you're stuck with an answer like, oh my gosh, what does this do? What does this do? Often a lot of things that countries do are done to increase legitimacy. So take, for example, Russia, Iran, and Nigeria, they all have runoff elections. So if you have a candidate who doesn't have the majority, then they have a runoff election. So in Russia, they have the policy where you have to have over 50%. Now, Putin has had over 60%. Now, there are a lot of reasons that Putin gets 60%, but the fact is they haven't had to have a runoff election. Nigeria actually makes that kind of more specific, that they have a runoff election that you have to win 25% of 2/3 of the states in order to become president. Now, why would they do that? Now, remember, Nigeria is a country with over 250 different ethnic groups. Now, they do have 3 major groups, but there's over 250 different ethnic groups. It is a very diverse country, which is why it has a federal system. And so for a president to represent the whole country, to say that he got 25 or she got 25% of 2/3 of the states, that's much more representative, much more democratic. It would also increase the legitimacy of that government. All right, so Russian and Iranian presidents, they must have a clear majority of popular vote. So again, it's that over 50%. And so there's often, in Iran, there'll be tons of people running for president. And so they may have to do a runoff election with the top votes. Do remember in Iran, though, that you've got, just like in Russia, you definitely have limitations on who's running. One of the reasons that, Russia is considered illiberal, I would argue soft authoritarianism. I think it's very difficult to argue that Russia is an illiberal democracy at this point, because to be a democracy, by definition, you have to have free, fair, competitive elections. Free, fair, competitive elections. The difference between a liberal and illiberal is that in an illiberal democracy, civil liberties, civil rights are not protected. Clearly, they're not protected in Russia. If you don't know that at this point, you need to go back and watch some videos on Russia. The question I have, though, is that are those elections free, fair, and competitive in Russia? Because there are registration limitations. There have been clear attacks on anyone who has Alexei Navalny, I never say his name correct, who's been a major opponent to Putin, has been put in jail. He's been brought up on embezzlement charges. All of these that everybody recognizes are not legitimate charges. There are strict registration requirements. And so it's not a free, fair, competitive election. And so therefore, soft authoritarian state. Same thing in Iran. Iran cannot be considered an illiberal democracy when not anyone can run for office. Remember, the Guardian Council has those two V powers. It can veto and it can vet. And so they vet the candidates who are running for the Majlis, who are running for parliament. They vet the candidates who are running for president. And they tend to get rid of people who are too reform, who are too liberal. All right, election details. Continuing to think about legislatures. In Mexico, they have a bicameral legislature, the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies, and they have a mixed system. So their partial election is by single member district and then partial by proportional representation. And I think this is a really neat system and provides for more representation, especially of those smaller parties who may not, say, be elected to president. In the UK, they have a bicameral system. Do remember, though, that the upper house, the House of Lords, which doesn't have as much power, it's really that lower house, the House of Commons, that has that real power. Only the House of Commons is elected, and they are elected through single member district, first past the post. And they are a parliamentary system, and the House of Lords, are appointed. A lot of those are inherited positions still. And there's a big argument to change that, because with the fact that the House of Lords, it's a question to think about. How democratic is that if those positions are appointed or inherited? In Russia, they have a bicameral Congress as well. They have, again, just like the UK, that the Duma, the lower house, is a much more powerful house. The Federation Council is appointed. Those are appointed by the governors of the states. And keep in mind that the governors of the states can be removed by the president. Also remember that the president, this is, extra tidbit, remember that the president of Russia can also dissolve the Duma. The threat of that is enough often to persuade them to do what you want them to do. But they have a mixed system. They have changed their constitution several times and gone back and forth. China is unicameral. Members are actually the National People's Congress, the 3,000 of them that meet for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. 2 weeks in the summer, and they just rubber stamp, which basically just means that they just approve what has been handed down from the Central Committee, the Standing Committee, the Politburo kind of thing. And these members are chosen indirectly by local and regional elections. Iran is unicameral, the Majlis as well, and they are elected single member district or first past post. Please remember that they also are vetted, even the people who run for the Majlis. They also have reserved seats for the religious minorities, for the Zoroasters. There's 2 seats reserved for the Armenians who are Christian. There's a Jewish reserved seat. There's a reserved seat, as I mentioned, for the Zoroaster. There is no reserved seat for the Baha'i. Remember that the Baha'i are persecuted against in Iran. In Nigeria, they have a bicameral legislature named just like the United States, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they are elected simply under the first past the post single member district. Now, Mexico and Nigeria have put in independent election commissions to monitor elections to work out voter fraud, and anything like that. You know, if you go into a Nigerian ballot, we were talking about this the other day in class about how that you're going to see a lot of pictures of the political parties. Remember that you have a low literacy rate in Nigeria. We're talking like 70% whole country. Women have a lower literacy rate, and it's an even lower literacy rate, remember, in the north. And so you see a lot of pictures on things so that people know who they're voting for, what party they're voting for. Remember that, we'll get this in a minute, but political parties are very regional in Nigeria. But they both do have these agencies that are set up to regulate elections and make sure that there isn't voter fraud things. For example, in Mexico in 2012, I got to do the math there. 2012, when Nieto was elected, there was a lot of discussion about voter fraud. Remember, again, the vetting of the Guardian Council. Iran, as I mentioned already, has the religious minority reserve seats. And appointments do happen where we bypass elections. You can discuss, that's less democratic. Does that increase your legitimacy of your country, or would you imagine it decreases it? So I've mentioned the House of Lords already. I've mentioned the Federation Council in Russia. The Guardian Council in Iran, with that important powers of veto and vetting, there are 12 members. 6 of those members are appointed by the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, and the other 6 are appointed by what basically is their Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. However, who chooses the Supreme Court of the Justice of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice? That would be chosen by the Ayatollah. So in essence, the Ayatollah really has the say on all 12 of these members. All right, so political party systems. We mentioned that first past the post really leads to two-party or two-party dominant systems. So what are the advantage of two-party systems? Well, you definitely have a closer relationship between the representatives and constituencies because they represent, you know, an area, they're electing those people, and it can represent a closer relationship. The governments tend to be more stable because you don't have coalitions, and there's usually often peaceful transfers of power like we see in the United States. It is more efficient in governing because you're going to get things accomplished because you're not having coalitions and lots of different voices heard. And the two-party system really simplifies voters' decisions. As long as you have a winner-take-all system, you're going to continue to see two-party dominant systems. Multi-party systems, though, multi-party systems are definitely going to be supported by proportional representation. And there's a kind of a combination of everything, and make sure that no single party, you know, often wins the majority, though, which can be difficult. And so you see countries like Germany, Italy, who are constantly having to form coalitions. Now, Chancellor Merkel in Germany, like, they've had successful coalitions, and she's been in charge for a long time. But that doesn't always happen in countries. The countries with multi-party systems that we study, Nigeria has a multi-party system, Russia has a multi-party system, Mexico has a multi-party system. Iran technically has a multi-party system. So the UK is a two-party dominant system, and China, of course, is a one-party system. So in a multi-party system, we're going to see a much diverse representation. Parties are more accountable because they're answering, you know, directly to people, and they're also more representative. In a two-party system, you're going to see more kind of broader interests that there. In a multi-parties, you can have very specific parties. Think about in the United States, like third parties tend to rise like over specific kind of topics or issues. So when you have two-party systems, you know, you often have maybe more catch-all parties. What we think about in a single-party system, you know, kind of comes, or a one-party system will emerge sometimes for a variety of reasons. And you can have like a coup that establishes a single party. You can have a really charismatic leader. Like, for example, if we look at the one-party dominant system that we have in Russia, United Russia is a party that is really dominated by the very charismatic President Putin. An economic crisis can even lead to that. You can have something like the Nazi Party, where they put in the Constitution that you have this single party. The advantage of a political parties, one-party state would be having definite stability and uniform policies. It's more efficient. You have a single voice. Definitely not more legitimate, but it's definitely going to be much more uniform. All right, so let me try to kind of expand this here so we can see. So when we're looking here at what I did was I kind of put for each of the countries, and I mentioned this a little bit already, but I put in kind of what they are. Are they multi-party, two-party dominant, one-party dominant, one-party? Iran has really no formal party structure, and then Nigeria is multi-party. Now, Mexico is a multi-party after having decades of one-party dominant. And one-party dominant was the PRI, and that lasted until 2000 when Vicente Fox was elected president. And the UK has the two-party dominant with active third parties. And Russia is a one-party dominant with United Russia. So when we look at then the second column is what are the political parties centered around? So in Mexico, the parties are based on ideology. In UK, it's based on ideology. Russia, it's often around a popular person. There is some ideological ones as well. And then in Nigeria, they're very regionally based and often tied around a popular person and can come and go. Like parties don't necessarily last. So as we're looking at Mexico, the parties that we should know, the PRI, which is a catch-all party, the PDP and the PRD. So when we think about, excuse me, it's the PNP. I got getting all my things left. The PRD, they are more, excuse me, and the Moreno. Sorry, I'm getting, had a little typo there. So the Moreno is the current party of the current president, AMLO, and we're going to talk a little bit about them in the question that we have at the end. UK have the Conservatives and the Labour Party, Liberal Democrats, Scottish National Party, some others. All right. So impact of social movements and interest groups. Social movements, this is taken straight from the College Board. They're large groups of people that want some kind of political and social change. And I'm going to give you some examples in just a moment. Interest groups, they're a wonderful example of civil society. And if you remember from previous videos, as we talked about, civil society is often a term that comparative government students mix up. And civil society has to be voluntary, and they are not controlled by the government. And so this is a big issue in countries. And grassroots social movement, this is like from the ground up, a lot of power at the local level, and then can even like move up to the internet, regional, national levels. And they today they're very much grassroots, do a lot of movement through social media. So as we look at some examples, a lot of times what we see is where the social movements put pressure on the state to actually make change. And so let's give some examples. So we have in Iran the Green Movement in 2009. Now this is a direct result of opposition to Ahmadinejad, who was the president, and all signs point to these elections were definitely rigged. This was his re-election. There's a great John Green video. It's called Iran WTF, and it's all about the elections. And it talks about, you know, the movements that come afterwards. And people were out protesting. Students are out, young people, like he's less popular then than he was when he was elected. And it's just a mess, and people are out protesting, rightly so, and they are using Twitter and other things to get the word out there. And then the government starts pushing them down, and there is violence and unrest. And finally, the Ayatollah comes out and says, accept the elections. And they do. In Mexico, one of the best examples is the Zapatista movement in 1994. This was done in the Chiapas region, which is a large Amerindian region, the native population prior to the Spanish coming. And they specifically started this movement the day that NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, went into effect. They were not successful. But they were fighting for indigenous rights. In Nigeria, you've got the movement for the emancipation of Niger Delta, the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, which both are movements such as in the Niger Delta, even kind of going back further to the civil war that they had with the Biafra movement, wanting to have that Niger Delta be independent. But that's where all the oil is. So Nigeria's not going to let them go easily. Then, of course, you have Boko Haram, the death to Western education folks, who ISIS even considers extreme. Just think about that for a moment. ISIS considers Boko Haram extreme. Really tells you all you need to know about Boko Haram. So they're strong in the north of Nigeria, and they want their own Islamic state in Africa, and they bordered over in different areas, and the government in Nigeria really has a trouble fighting with them. In Russia, there have been a lot of domestic protests. A lot of them get put down. You've got rebellious groups like Pussy Riot that have spoken out a lot. You've got Alexander Navalny himself, and the whole kind of famous where he got green paint thrown in his face. He's such a fascinating person and really interesting things. There's some really great videos that you could Google on him about his movements. I'll put a link to my webpage also down in the doobly-doo, and I've got videos about all different things on there that you're welcome to look at. All right, so we're thinking about pluralist and corporatist systems. So honestly, one of the best examples of a pluralist state in the entire world is the United States. We're talking about an active interest group kind of society. And this is competition among different groups that are not linked to the government. This is actually what James Madison, when he wrote our Constitution and argued for this large republic, this is that pluralist theory that he really hoped that we would see. But in many places, what we instead see is kind of the hyper-pluralist, that competing ideology. But I digress. We're focusing on our CG6 here. So what we see is that Mexico used to be a corporate state and has moved to pluralist. And the UK has also moved to pluralist as well. Everybody else still remains a corporatist system. Okay, so Mexico and the UK are only pluralists. And so these are democratic regimes that encourage the formation of civil society and interest groups. And these different groups kind of they try to influence policy in the government and to persuade officials through lots of different things. Remember that interest groups do lobbying and litigation, electioneering, and grassroots movements, things to get their voice heard, social movements. In corporatists, the government controls the access to policy making, and there's just single groups or associations that represent groups that are allowed to have a voice. So when you look at, say, Nigeria, that kind of wants that pluralist system, they have prebendalism, which is their form of, kind of the voices in government, is that through the corruption and different things where you see this patronage system where, I scratch you back, you scratch mine. This is how kind of voices are heard. But the only state-sanctioned groups can have if you say, seat at the table. Again, this is information taken from the College Board, but they then get rewarded and want to maintain what they have. It's kind of this continual cycle that you see. Okay, so this really wraps up all of Unit 4, and I just want to do a practice question before we leave. Just a reminder, so in my previous videos, the first 3, I adapted them from the things that I did last year. So if anything you were listening to those previous 3 videos might have been referencing the COVID test, please remember that this is the format for 2021. So we have 55 multiple choice questions, which is half of your test, and you have 60 minutes to do those. The free response questions, there are 4 of them. You have the recommended times to spend on things, and they take you get 90 minutes. You have a conceptual analysis, a quantitative analysis, comparative analysis, and then your argumentative essay. Next unit, I'm going to do another example with the argumentative essay. I've done examples with the argumentative essay in the previous ones that you've looked. I've done conceptual analysis, quantitative analysis as well. And so in the comparative, you're comparing countries. This is what we're looking at, and then like a concept within that. Conceptual is more just like a idea that we need to know, like economic systems or electoral systems. And then quantitative analysis, we're looking at data chart, and then we're going to make some kind of choice of that. So let's look at our sample question here. So this is from the fantastic Mr. Kaneen from his citizen.u page that he runs with Mr. Larson, teachers out of Chicago. And this is our sample from this unit related to, and this is a quantitative example question. So you'll get some kind of image like we see here. So again, I take no credit for writing this question. This is from Mr. Kaneen, citizenu.org. You can see more sample questions. If you go there, go over to your right, go down to the list, and there's a comparative corner. All right, so we're looking here, it says the last 3 lower chamber elections, and we're looking at Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia. I always like to kind of, I just want to take a glance there, and then I like to read the question and then go back to look at the table again. So A says, explain how a pattern of data in the table relates to illiberal democracy in Russia. B, using the data in the table, draw a conclusion about multi-party competition in Mexico. C, explain how data in the table relates to democratization in Nigeria. All right, so one great thing you could do is like pause right now and then try to answer the question and then come back and see if you got the same answer that I did. So obviously, a lot of these questions, there's different ways that you can answer them. I'm just going to go with what I would do if I saw this on the test. All right, so A says, explain how a pattern of data in the table relates to a liberal democracy. So if I'm answering this question, I'm actually start by, because it says explain, so I'm going to define what an illiberal democracy is. And you can say that in an illiberal democracy, there are there are elections that are supposed to be fair, free, and competitive, but civil liberties are not protected. So let's look over here, and it says how it relates to Russia. So if I go to Russia, and I look here, and I see that United Russia is dominating. So what do I see? I see this in a liberal democracy that I've got a one-party dominant system. And especially if you compare this to the others, with the exception of the most recent election by Mexico, you don't have any one-party dominating things. And so in my question, I would talk about how the fact that United Russia, the dominant political party, is the one-party system of Putin, and how that he is dominating elections with election restrictions. We talked about the registration of political parties and possible election and government fraud. And you can see how, and you need to talk about it, it says explain a pattern. And you need to say, as you can see in 2016, 2011, and 2007, that the United Russia Party dominates the elections in the Duma. Okay, so make sure that you are explaining a pattern, okay? And then you got to make that connection to why this makes it an illiberal democracy. All right, using the data in the table, draw a conclusion about the multi-party competition in Mexico. So as you're looking here, I might actually talk about the fact that because they use single-member district and proportional representation, because they do a mix, then we're actually going to see that we're going to see more parties being represented. And so that knowledge that you have that they have a mixed system and do use proportional representation, then that allows for more multi-party competition. Okay, that's going to get you the point there on B, because you're talking about the fact that they do that mixed system. You also could even go back to A and talk about how that the single member district also could lead to the one part, that dominant United Russia. Explain how the data in the table relates to democratization in Nigeria. So democratization, of course, is the growth of democracy. And so you could argue that because the Nigerians use a single member district first past the post-election system, that is going to lead to a two-party dominant system. And that's what you see. Look at that. The PDP and the APC, really leading there. Or as they have become more democratic, they have a two-party dominant system. Okay, so there's just some possible ways to kind of answer that question. And you can check out more for the Unit 5 to wrap up everything to review for comparative government.